All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Essery. I'm an associate professor of politics and international affairs here at Wake Forest University. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium, a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and also sponsored by Springer Publishing. Today, we truly have the Voltron of IMC presentations. Many of us are combining into a whole. We're going to host a roundtable discussion of teaching political methodology to both undergraduates and graduate students. The roundtable is motivated by / supported by a symposium of papers that are currently at a stage of the review process at PS Political Science and Politics. And so hopefully you'll be able to see that symposium soon. And our discussion today will be guest hosted by Jeff Harden, McKenna Family Associate Professor of Political Science and Concurrent Associate Professor of Applied and Computational Mathematics and Statistics at the University of Notre Dame, who's also guest editing that symposium. Our panelists are in alphabetical order. Fred Boehmke, Director of the Iowa Social Science Research Center and Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. David Brown, Professor of Political Science at UC Boulder. Katherine Bryant, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Westmont College. Diogo Ferrari, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Riverside. Alan Jacobs, Professor of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. Diana Kapaszewski, Provost Distinguished Associate Professor at Georgetown University. God, I don't know how some of you guys fit this on your business cards. Sebastian Karcher, Associate Director of the Qualitative Data Repository and Research Assistant Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University. Shauna Metzger, Assistant Professor General Faculty of Politics at the University of Virginia. Andrew Phillips, Assistant Professor of Political Science at UC Boulder. Clay Webb, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Kansas. And Rob Williams, Postdoctoral Research Fellow at Washington University in St. Louis. So every team, some people are on teams, will take about 8 minutes to make a brief presentation. And then after that point, we'll take questions from the audience. And I should say you can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window at any time during the talks. Jeff, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Justin, and thanks everyone for being here today. It's great to be able to do this event. This was something that at the IMC we came up with actually a few years ago. It got delayed a little bit, unfortunately, by the pandemic, but here we are able to host this event. And as Justin mentioned, soon you'll be able to read more in the symposium in PS. So the motivation for this symposium and the roundtable today is actually pretty simple. We noticed that in political methodology, there are many great opportunities for us to get feedback on our research, this being at conferences, as well as events such as those hosted by the IMC. But the other part of our job, teaching political methodology, sometimes it's more difficult to get help or to get new ideas. And especially if you're a junior scholar, maybe just starting out in a job, it's possible that you might even be the only methods person, as they say, in your department. And so where do you turn to get some ideas, to get help with course development, that sort of thing? The idea behind this symposium and our roundtable today is just to start collecting some wisdom about teaching methodology, both to undergraduates and to graduate students. And so that's what I hope that everyone is able to take away from our time together today. So with that, I'm gonna actually turn it over to our various speakers so that we have plenty of time to get through everyone's presentation. So our first one that we're gonna go to is, I believe, is it gonna be Andy Phillips? It's the CU Boulder crowd. And they're gonna be talking specifically about integrating software into undergrad research methods courses. Take it away, Andy.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Justin. You all can see that okay? So our title, like Jeff said, is integrating the use of statistical software into undergraduate political methodology courses. This is co-authored work with Kate Bryant, who's at Westmont College, who's going to talk about some of our results, as well as David Brown, who's here at CU. And we have several motivations for this. What's kind of become a bigger project, I think, in a lot of ways, and this idea, like most good ideas, started at a bar at Midwest, where Kate and I were talking about just how little information there is on teaching undergraduate methods, and then really how big of a range there is in terms of what we're expected to teach when we teach undergraduate methods. And David has a textbook that I think is coming out soon, and so he's also been super into this as well. And I think the easy starting point is that teaching these political methodology courses is a huge challenge. There's a big emphasis on data analysis and data literacy. So the expectation is more and more undergraduates are expected to take these classes. And oftentimes the easiest way to introduce these concepts is through the use of statistical software. And other than anecdotes, talking to others, we weren't really sure who's using what in political methodology courses, and then especially how are they using software to present particular topics. So really we have three big interests in this paper. How are undergraduate political methodology courses structured, meaning what software do they use, what topics do they cover? We are wondering how exactly is software used in the classroom. And then our broader picture is what is working well and what is not working so well. And as I mentioned before, this is part of a larger project. We have 4 great undergrad research assistants, and we'll talk a little bit about our instructor survey and syllabi coding, but we are going to conduct interviews later this summer. So let me give the setups, and then I'll let Kate take it over. So in January 2021, hopefully all of you answered this kindly. We sent out a survey of political science instructors, both on the PolMess listserv as well as Facebook. We ended up getting about 150 total responses from a mix of school types, which was good, a mix of private and public schools as well, and also a mix of instructor types. So we'll show a bunch of results from the survey. The second thing that we have in this paper is a syllabi collection, which in the paper it's a little preliminary. Now it's much more established. So we had 4 undergrad RAs here at CU code about 116 syllabi so far. So this would be going to a website and obtaining or emailing, asking for someone's syllabi. And we have about 46 in the current paper. And what they're doing is coding certain characteristics, such as the rank and gender of the instructor, as well as course details. So, is there a textbook? Is it required? What software is being used? What topics are being covered? And we have a nice mix there as well of public and private, as well as R1, R2s, liberal arts, and things like that. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kate, and she's going to talk about some of our findings.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So as Andy was saying, the syllabi and the survey are really useful because we can get at kind of 2 different groups of people, groups that are on the PolMeth listserv, and groups of people that teach research methods, but maybe aren't as engaged in the PolMeth community. So our main findings here are based on about 137 survey results and 130 syllabi. So we can see that R is actually very common, which kind of surprised us because we know from the complaints of our students and our own kind of griping to each other that R has a really steep learning curve, and that students often complain about, the code is wrong. I can't believe, just one typo led to that horrible red error code that we get. So we see that within the syllabi, about 46% of syllabi respondents said that they were using R and/or RStudio. A surprisingly high percentage was using SPSS. And then when we look at the survey, we see a similar trend, somewhat higher in the survey, which makes sense. lower numbers for SPSS. And then we had a really great question that Andy came up with, which is, which software package would you guess is most likely used in courses like yours? And people tend to kind of fall into three groups. They believe R, SPSS, and Stata are being used, but many of them would recommend either R or Python. And these are programs that are more complex. They have kind of a higher initial cost. But as we're moving forward and as we're looking at job markets for undergrads, we know that data literacy is of increasing importance for undergraduate students. All right, moving on, another question that we asked was looking at how the course is structured. So in other words, how is software being used in the course? Most of the courses here do use problem sets, labs, or homeworks. We didn't have we did also see that group sets were common as well, but not maybe as prevalent as our experience would want them to be. Working in group settings is also often really beneficial for students, as they can kind of put their brains together, problem solve, and then you can have the more data literate students help out those that may be struggling. Papers were required for a little over half of courses in both the syllabi and in both the syllabi coding and the survey. The biggest difference here, which is somewhat surprising, is that according to the syllabi, only 4% of those courses required a paper presentation. And given the importance of being able to communicate data results, this was quite surprising. Even within the survey, this was quite low. One challenge with that may be that you have large classes. If you're teaching 50 to 100 plus students in a class, having them all do a presentation is probably not very feasible. All right, we have the awful yellow button coming on. All right, so very quickly, we also looked at what type of topics are covered between the syllabi and the survey. Some of the main differences here that we didn't ask all of the same questions within the survey and the syllabi. So these gaps we'll be able to go back into the survey data with our wonderful undergraduates and fill in. But I'll highlight a couple here. Graphics are really underutilized. And so again, when we're thinking about data literacy and data skills that you can transfer to the job market, we would want students to capitalize on that. All right, we'll just jump to the next slide here, Andy. Then finally, we were looking at software use, disaggregating between public and private institutions, as well as regionally within the survey, within the syllabi data, excuse me. And being on the West Coast, I'll just note that the West Coast is lagging behind in terms of software use. So that's a bit concerning. So just to wrap up here, we have quite a bit of future work to do that we're excited about. We're going to finish up and kind of flesh out our survey, our syllabi data and connect it to our survey data. We'll also be conducting interviews this summer and hopefully creating a website with a repository of data exercises, syllabi, and resources for instructors in the future. So we look forward to moving on and getting some feedback. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much. I should mention before to go to the next presentation that we do have one other paper in the symposium on undergraduate research methods, and that's by Lana Atkinson at the University of New Mexico. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, but her contribution will be in our symposium. So we're going to move now to thinking about graduate methods training. And to start us off in that category, I'm going to go to Fred Boehmke. Fred, are you ready?
Sure, I'm ready. I was going to make a joke at the start of this about being in a method symposium and having imposter syndrome, not about methods, but about talking about teaching. And that's kind of how I feel and kind of how I felt when I was writing up my article, but Jeff didn't stop me. And so I assume that means it's okay. We'll see when we get those reviews back. And now we've had a presentation with nice slides and data and all sorts of things. Mine is more of a philosophical take on teaching methods. And I guess I would say that it's based on a participant observation study that I've been conducting for 20 years. And so it's just kind of me thinking about how my approach to teaching graduate, but also undergraduate methods has evolved. And I won't go into all the details that are in the article because hopefully you'll be able to read it someday. And I would say, I also want to thank Jeff for organizing this. I think that making these resources available for other people to draw on as they're designing their own courses and thinking about this is going to be really helpful. And the fact that in the previous study, they noted that there was not a lot of published research on this makes me feel better about not citing that non-existent published research and perhaps contributing a little bit of it. I think that one of our jobs as methodologists is to proselytize a little bit about the value of methods and to try and present it to students in a way that will attract them to it. And I mean that at both the graduate and undergraduate level. A lot of what I, say and think about this applies to both. And one of the favorite things that students say to me after a class or something is, hey, I never thought I would like that. Or, I never knew that I could be a methodologist or that I could use or teach methods, but it turns out it does matter for my work. And so I think part of our job is trying to help students realize that potential or that possibility. It's not going to work for everyone, but I think if we can present the material in a way that helps them engage with it and see the value of it to what they want to do, which is research or consulting, whatever other career plans they have, then we've done a pretty good job. I guess what I would say is that students come into my classes, graduate classes at Iowa, feeling like methods is something that other people do. It's not something that they're going to do. And I try to approach the material and content in a way that helps them understand it and perhaps for some of them see that they are the kind of person who can do methods, even if they didn't necessarily suspect that. And so kind of my thoughts are organized around how we can reach students on methods and how we can present the material in a way to accomplish that. And the approach that I take, I talk a little bit in the article about how when I got to Iowa, Iowa has always had a reputation as a place that provides good quantitative methods training. I came from a fairly technical program at Caltech, and so I just taught it the way I'd been taught it. And I figured out pretty quickly that wasn't the right way to reach the students at Iowa. I think the median age of the students in my first intro to methods class was me. And so a lot of them were coming from different backgrounds and different careers and weren't necessarily excited about getting into an intro stats class that was using calculus and stuff. And so I've kind of evolved my approach to that to fit the students, and that's changed over time. And the way I see it is that the job is to teach methods in lots of different ways. And that is to say, to introduce a topic and discuss it, not just mathematically, not just visually, not just with intuition, but also with examples and simulations. And because I think that different students, talking a little bit about teaching, right, will have different learning styles. And our job as instructors with material of the nature that methods involves being at least somewhat technical, especially at the graduate level in a lot of programs, you might teach it with some of the technical details, although that's not true everywhere, is to provide the students that might not be ready to access it from that purely mathematical point of view, different ways to get leverage on the material and to start to see its relevance and to start to be able to understand why you would want to do something, why you would want to use a particular method as opposed to another method. And so in pretty much all of my graduate syllabi or in the workshops I teach and such, I lay out very clearly that the goal, what I want them to walk away from the class with, perhaps some people call it a learning objective, is when to apply a given method, right? Why to apply it and what it does differently than common alternatives that are out there that someone might apply who perhaps hadn't taken an advanced or an intro level methods class or hadn't been exposed to that material. And then finally, how to understand and interpret the estimates they get in order to convey the relevance of the results for their substantive questions. And none of those three objectives really are about learning the math, right? Learning the math can help you do that, but you can accomplish most of those things at least in an applied way without fully understanding all the mathematical details. I am not saying that the mathematical details are irrelevant and then I don't teach them, just that that's not necessarily consistent with every student's long-term career objectives. And so it may not be that every student needs to master the material in the same way. And I also think that by approaching the material in different ways, it allows students to kind of fit those pieces together. When you fit the pieces together and you visualize, or you understand and you see the method from different angles, then I think that helps you understand it better. Even if you do understand one of those, the mathematical perspective or the intuitive perspective, doing it from multiple ways I think is helpful. And so, I guess I'll kind of provide a quick overview of how I approach this. There's an example for a particular topic that goes into some details that's in the paper that I wrote, or the, I don't know what to call it, research note. So in practice, right, I would start off by situating method very broadly within the literature. Say if I'm teaching an MLE course, kind of introduce one of a series of methods for discrete choice data or multinomial data or ordered data or count data, right? Sort of say how it fits on what we've done before and how it relates to other methods they may have seen in the past. Maybe talk through the equations a little bit. I do believe that when you're coming from a program like Iowa, it's important to see that. A lot of our students are comfortable with that approach to the material, and it kind of lays out the foundation and some of the necessary material for how to move forward later. But then I like to, supplement that with pictures, analogies, metaphors, examples. I remember Gary King came out with a whole bunch of stretchy springs one year at the PALMETH meeting to talk about multi-level modeling and random coefficients and that stuff. And it seemed very helpful. And so I draw pictures of snowplows and stuff to explain truncation and censoring and try and help the students understand, what's happening with the data. And then after that, we work through a series of discussions and exercises that approach it in different ways, right? And so that can be running the models, obviously just relatively simple commands, comparing the results that you get from that to alternative estimators, which might be considered simpler or more naive estimators, or perhaps even more complicated and unnecessarily so. In more advanced classes, I might have them program the estimator, because you got to work out those equations and see what happens when you get them into the software and really think about the details. I like to have the students generate data from the model or the estimator that we're working with. One of my personal sayings that I share with the students is that if you can't generate data from a model, you probably don't actually understand how that model works. And I've run into problems doing that in the past. And so I've sort of had that reinforced to myself that maybe I didn't actually understand what I was doing here. Once you can generate data from the model, then you can move on and do simulations. And through those simulations, you can say, okay, here's what happens when we estimate the right model. Now what happens when we estimate the wrong model? And with MLE, often you get into situations where you can't just write down the bias in a simple way with the wrong model. And so the simulations say, well, what happens if we slowly violate this assumption more and more and more? What happens in these other estimators? So I'll stop because there's bright lights flashing, and that's a good point to end. So thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Justin, for helping to organize this. And I'm excited about hearing the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Fred. Our next contributor is Clay Webb from the University of Kansas, and his contribution is directed specifically at junior faculty. Take it away, Clay.
Okay, so this is written with Soren Jordan from Auburn University. He, Andy, Katherine, and I all went to graduate school together at Texas A&M. And we're interested, Soren and I are interested in avoiding and learning from mistakes made by junior scholars. So the motivation here is that, as it's already been pointed out, political methodology courses are the hardest courses to teach, yet inexperienced young faculty are often the people who are tasked with teaching them. So there are a lot of resources available to young faculty. Oxford and Sage have published handbooks that cover varieties of topics with really nice chapters on things like time series analysis, panel data, what have you. There have been a couple of articles that are describing the subfield of political methodology, which you can imagine putting at the front end of a syllabus in a graduate course. And then there are incredibly well-written textbooks by some of the brightest minds in political science. But while those things are very helpful, none of those resources really offer the most pressing question for a young faculty member who is tasked with writing their first syllabus, which is, what material should I cover and how should I deliver that material? So seeing as how Soren and I are only recently joining the ranks as associate professors, we're not entirely sure that we are the best people to come up with all the best wisdom about how one should do that, despite the mistakes that at least I have made in delivering this material. So we surveyed the APSA poll meth section in the fall of 2020, and we asked participants a series of different questions. We asked them to rate their performance in their classes, both in terms of their teaching evaluations and how much conflict they had with the students in their graduate and undergraduate classes, to reflect on the content of their syllabi when they first started teaching, and perhaps the differences between the syllabi that they used then versus the syllabi that they use now, identify the biggest mistakes that they made when they started teaching methods, and then offer advice for young faculty who are getting started in teaching methodology. We had 663 emails that were on the list of the current membership of the APSA poll meth section at the time, and we got 109 responses, which isn't great in terms of a response rate, but as far as elite surveys go, I suppose it isn't too bad. And it's not like we're trying to get something that is necessarily representative. We're just trying to distill a little bit of wisdom about the teaching of methods. So who responded? We got a really nice mixture of ranks. 66% of respondents were either associate professors, full professors, or endowed professors. So people with the most experience who might have the most advice. About 22% of people were assistant professors in tenure track positions, and the remaining respondents were either in non-tenure track lines or were graduate students, which might seem a bit odd, but as my friends from Texas A&M know, and I think this is true in a lot of places around the country, graduate students do get experience teaching undergraduates, so their perspectives are interesting and as well. In terms of the other demographics that might be of interest, about 75% of the sample is male, 75% of the sample is white, which is not terribly diverse, but is sort of consistent with the poll meth diversity, something we're working on currently, of course. More than half of all respondents said that they had taught undergraduate or graduate methods at some point, and 75% of the respondents were from US universities. So the first task, the task that we thought would work very nicely, was that we would ask people to reflect on their syllabi early on and answer questions about, what did you emphasize too much? What did you emphasize too little? And from the responses, we could distill the most balanced syllabus possible, and we'd be able to talk about what that was. So, we give them a Likert item from too little emphasis to too much emphasis, and we get responses. And so the idea was that, well, if you overemphasize something and you underemphasize something else, then the good syllabus is the one that emphasizes the most material. And while there's a lot going on here, the sort of easy way to read what we're seeing here is that the light gray values are the things that receive too much emphasis. So in addition to this question, we also asked sort of like basic questions. The majority of people, like 90%, said that they tried to cover too much material, and that was one of the biggest mistakes. But then when we asked them, what did you emphasize too much? You notice there's not very much light gray. So we have this weird problem where people realize that they're trying to cover too much material, but all of them think that they need to cover more of that same material, or certainly not less of any of it. Which says something strange about people who design these courses, perhaps, but isn't terribly helpful in terms of how you would balance your syllabus. Long story short, we get a similar effect with the undergraduate methods. I suppose the one thing worth noting is that in terms of overemphasizing statistics, I guess I should say the topics we identified are data analysis, measurement, programming, statistics, theory, and writing. And in terms of overemphasis on statistics, it is worth noting that among the tenure track assistant professors, that was the group most self-aware that perhaps they were overdoing it with the number of equations in their slides. So we are not as hapless as you might think, senior colleagues. So strategy 2 then was to say, if we can't balance the syllabus, maybe we can subset the data on the people who had the best teaching evaluations. The problem with that approach was that everybody reported having really good teaching evaluations and everybody reported having very low conflict with their students. So that wasn't helpful either. So we were reduced to the old-fashioned thing, which is just asking people, what are the biggest mistakes you made when you taught graduate and undergraduate courses, and what advice would you have for young faculty member who are getting started? So we got a subset of the respondents who offered written responses to these open-ended questions. We broke them into topics, and then based on those topics, categorized the responses into sort of specific pieces of advice and sort of tallied those things. And so in the article, we outlined the pieces of advice that seemed the most sage and appeared most often. So the primary mistakes to avoid were unrealistic expectations, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. It turns out that if you're the person who has the methods job at your new university, you are probably more enthusiastic about methods than most people. And as a consequence, you can't expect people to adopt your study habits or have the same enthusiasm as you did for the material. And so you need to temper your expectations and be prepared to start with very simple ideas. How do I load my data? What does the p-value mean, et cetera. The other is covering too much material, which we can't offer much advice on, but you need to pick and choose your battles, try and identify what's most important. Among the advice given for new faculty, the thing that occurred most often was that you should ask your senior colleagues at your university what their expectations are. They have a better sense than you do of what the students that you're likely to encounter need and want. And if the students should rebel, they are also the ones who will either have your back or who will not have your back, depending on whether or not you solicited their advice. So that seemed like a good idea. Don't forget about your other responsibilities. You probably have a 40-40-20 contract, so you should not spend 80% of your time building slides for your research methods course. And a way to do that is to keep things relatively simple. Don't try and teach everything you know. And if you can, borrow materials from people who have taught the class before, or collaborate with other people to build those materials out. And so that is the advice. Those are the mistakes. Avoid the mistakes and take the advice.
All right, thank you very much, Clay. Our next couple of presentations are going to be looking a little bit more in detail at some techniques that we can use for teaching. So first up from that group is Shauna Metzger from the University of Virginia, and she's going to be talking to us a little bit about R-Shiny.
Thank you. So just two quick pieces of information to start. Everything I touch on today, I not only get into in more detail in the PS Symposium, but also in my forthcoming monograph at the Cambridge Element series. So please give that a look. And then also all of the code demo I talk about today is also available through my GitHub and can be run through my GitHub. Now, why you might want to run this code through my GitHub is, as Jeff said, we're going to talk about how exactly we might be able to get our students more engaged actively with the econometric ideas that we are conveying to them through the use of interactive apps, which we're going to get there using Shiny. So if you're not familiar with Shiny, this is a package in R. And what it gives you the ability to do by using the R code you're already familiar with is to create an app that's viewable in a web browser that anyone with a web browser can then view. As far as what these apps can do, I mean, if R can do it, Shiny can do it, and Shiny can do more than R, so sort of the sky is the limit there. So if you're someone that does best looking at examples, as I think many of us do, RStudio has an official Shiny app gallery to take a look through. In political science, there are also several examples. Potentially the one that this audience is maybe most familiar with is the Shiny Stand package in R. And what this package does is provide you with post-model diagnostics about your Markov chain Monte Carlos. And the GUI that comes with this package is all written in Shiny, as the name might suggest. Now, as far as how exactly we can go about using this to teach, right, our students, graduate or undergraduate, it comes to being able to convey certain ideas in a much more concise way, and also gives the students the ability to kind of come to certain realizations on their own. So to motivate by way of example, what's currently on the screen, this is one of the apps I assign my students in my grad methods class when we're talking about logit, and specifically how exactly we come to the best fit line of a logit model. So this is exactly what students see when they load up the app for the first time. And what they can do is choose how big their fake data set's going to be. I'm just going to put it small for speed reasons. They generate their fake data, and then they get a whole bunch of information available to them, right? And they're told that they need to find apparently the slope and intercept that gives them the largest likelihood value, whatever that is. But even if they don't know what that is yet, by moving the sliders, the graph on the right immediately responds to it. And it's fairly intuitive to at least be able to eyeball this and try to find a combination of slider values that appears to fit the data best. Now, this sort of interactivity where it clearly helps to have context as to what these ideas are, but bottom line, right, you just need to be able to draw sliders and kind of eyeball what you're seeing on the right. This is the power of Shiny in a nutshell, right? It's this dynamicism that allows our students to experiment with the methods we discuss and talk about in a way that's much more wheeling, rather than in a guided sense than usual, right? Because by doing this, we're allowing our students a much greater chance of actively constructing the knowledge available to them, right? So it's not just them receiving information from us and potentially discussing it with us, right? But them sitting there at their computer, experimenting with these various sliders in a very low stakes environment. You also may have noticed when I just flashed the app up that there was no code that actually is visible to the users, right, if they're working with the app. And that's potentially very powerful if you just want to point the spotlight at certain pedagogically relevant details for a particular example. Because we all know sometimes the details of the things we're trying to illustrate involve some heavy duty code. So there's a potential fear that the students might get tied up with the code and not see the actual pedagogical point of doing the code. And of course, not necessarily the biggest benefit in my mind, but a really big side benefit is that depending on the sorts of topics you use for these apps, so I typically use them for illustrations of how the estimates are coming about, and then also Monte Carlo simulations. The students have infinite illustrative examples available to them, right, that we as the instructors don't have to come up with. So for instance, it's very easy for me to talk about what a likelihood function is and how hypothetically, right, you would just stick in the data values, this, that, and the other. But then there's something very powerful about being able to see simply from a data set of 25 to insert the actual n, and then to insert the current guess for the intercept, which is negative 2.5, negative 3.25 for the slope, show the log likelihood function, and then also in a section, like these are the actual values for x from the fake data set getting inserted. If students want to see, well, what happens if I change the intercept, they can easily change it, go back to the log likelihood expression, and it will update. Right now, everything is negative 0.25. And because for the apps that I use, I build in a random seed, they just need to then change the random seed, right? And they again can get infinite data sets available to them. Now, as far as, I guess, the more practical details, right? View this as my general pitch for why this is so powerful. As you've seen for technical skills, there's not really a whole much involved on our students' part, right? So they just need to be able to open a web browser and have a willingness to fiddle, which generally our students do, given the generation. If you're thinking ahead to your own situations and you're like, well, you know, Shauna has these apps, but maybe I want to cover something that her apps don't. In order to write these yourselves, you need an understanding of R. Beyond that, that's it. That's the skill you need. So in chapter 2 of the Cambridge monograph, I do talk about these sort of estimation apps and Monte Carlo simulations that I've written for these apps. And I give a sense of the structure of the apps. So then that way, if you want to start to try to fiddle yourselves, you have kind of a springboard where you can go in and make some small tweaks to something that currently exists, and then perhaps work your way up to building an app from the ground up. So to begin to wrap up with some of the practical considerations, right, you should view all of this up to this point as a pitch for how we can get material that is otherwise perhaps very dry and make our students see how they can actively engage with it, right, and see with their own eyes, visually and with equations and actual data sets, what this looks like in practice. The two biggest logistical details are how exactly you get these apps in the students' hands, and then how exactly you might integrate them into your own teaching. So as far as access, there's a whole bunch of ways to do this. So the way I distribute them to my students, right, all of my apps are up on my GitHub, and then using this service called Binder, students can then launch the links for these apps. So what Binder does is it instantiates a temporary Shiny server where the app then runs. And then when students close the tab, right, the server goes away. So what I would do in practice, if you're curious, is I would point them to the appropriate GitHub repo, and then I have a whole bunch of links, right, that say launch Binder next to the app name, and then students just need to click this link, and then they access the app. Lots of other ways to do it, but the long story short is Binder actually has the fewest drawbacks at the moment. Happy to get into those. Also happy to look at Appendix A and the element that goes into these. And as far as when to assign, this depends on your own teaching style. So for grad classes in particular, I usually assign these pre-class activity. give students one or two like informal questions to kind of think about the answers to. And I tell them to take 10, 15 minutes to fiddle with the app. And then that serves as our launch point for discussion in next class. For my undergrads, since I have a little more time, it might be an in-class exercise with group work, right, where they're talking with one another before we come back together. So with that, I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. Please make use of what I have available, and I'm sure other people do as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Shauna. All right, next we are going to go over to Rob Williams, who is going to talk to us a little bit about teaching programming skills. Take it away, Rob.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to you and Justin for organizing this. So a couple of the other panelists have had really great things on sort of tools you can use in the classroom to try and teach quantitative methods and programming to students. But I'm going to talk a little bit more sort of about trying to reorient ourselves and our perspectives as instructors teaching these courses. So, you know, there's lots of folk wisdom out there that teaching statistics is difficult, you know, maybe especially so to students in a social science course who didn't expect a lot of math. That goes doubly in undergraduate courses, and that teaching programming can also be difficult. And there's sort of a perception that programming is often an additional burden on top of what quote unquote really matters, which is the statistics, the research design, the ability to you know, ask and answer these questions. But I think that that view is actually doing our students a bit of a disservice. And that, you know, it may be tempting to use point and click software packages in undergraduate courses, but there's actually a lot of pedagogical value to teaching programming in both grad and undergraduate courses. But to really sort of understand this, you have to sort of think about the kind of broader cultural context that coding as an activity has taken on in recent years. So math as a subject is a subject that has lots of cultural baggage and stereotypes about who is and is not expected to be good at math. There's this whole idea of, you know, you can be a math person or not be a math person. And obviously these biases are stronger against non-male and non-white students. And if we then move into technology, these biases get even more pronounced, where lots of students in under-resourced K-12 school systems are less likely to have had exposures to computer as a subject of study in high school. Like they're using computers to complete their assignments, but they haven't had what are usually called computer technology courses in high school. And so coding as an activity these days has been imbued with a sort of high level of cultural meaning and cultural capital. It's often seen as a pathway to a rewarding career. You know, it can provide insight into the algorithms that increasingly affect our world, where we have things like algorithmic risk scores for sentencing and parole or credit. And, you know, it might also provide a little bit of protection against this looming specter of automation that's coming for a large percentage of the workforce. And so there's lots of intimidation that comes with coding. And there's a lot of sort of cultural baggage with it. And this can be especially intimidating because, you know, a lot of our students don't have exposure, especially at the undergraduate level, to computers as a technology. Like most undergraduate students don't know what a directory or what a file path is. And you often have to spend, you know, a good chunk of class the first several weeks explaining how to find a file and how to load it into whatever statistical software you have. So there's a lot of reasons why it could be tempting to sort of glance over this, maybe stick with a less programming, less coding oriented approach. But I think there's actually a lot of benefits to students for coding and programming. And the big one is that when they succeed at something, when they're programming and coding, due to all this cultural meaning that it's been imbued with, they sort of view this as like a very large victory. It's sort of an important accomplishment compared to just learning, you know, how mathematical and statistical concepts build upon one another. And pedagogically, what's most important is that coding provides lots of opportunities for short-term positive reinforcement cycles where students are able to finally figure out how to you know, create a bar plot or finally figure out how to subset data. And then they can immediately do that and do it again. And then when you introduce some other concept on top of that in the next 2 weeks, they're able to go back and see how they were able to achieve that. And so this can really help in statistics courses where there's lots of long-term accumulation of knowledge and the benefits aren't really apparent until the end. You have to get all the way through null hypothesis significance testing for most students to really see the benefit of learning what a probability distribution is and why it matters in a social science course. And so there's also a lot of long-term benefits for students in teaching them programming in methods courses. So there's the obvious job skills that students can go out, especially undergraduate students who may not be pursuing grad school in social sciences. But there's also transferable skills to learning programming languages in other courses. If they take an actual computer science course or maybe an econometrics course, the code that they're left with after the course is very easy to go back to and rerun. And they've got lots of documentation from you as the instructor. Whereas if they just point and click their way through an entire semester, they're sort of more reliant on the notes that they took and their memories of it. And I'll also note that when I taught undergraduate stats, multiple students told me that they felt that they were going to take these skills and use them in their final projects in another course they were taking that semester, or they were going to take in the future. So it's not just graduate students who use these skills to go on and apply them to their own research. And I think another really important, often overlooked aspect is that quantitative methods in political science can be a pathway into these really desirable data science careers for students who the traditional data science disciplines of computer science often don't do a good job of serving and recruiting and retaining. Students who are often sort of marginalized in these departments could come to find an understanding, an appreciation of these skills and these tools in a political science course. And I say that as a white guy who grew up in Silicon Valley and was still too intimidated to take a CS course in undergrad. So I'm just going to briefly talk about how do I apply this sort of view of the cultural meaning and importance of programming in my undergrad stats courses, because it's sort of a little easier to do these things in grad courses. But the biggest thing for me was just normalizing the difficulty of struggling with programming, not just dealing with errors, as they come up as students are working, but really emphasizing, how often you, as a quote unquote professional in coding, encounter these errors in your daily life. And so, whenever you work through an error with a student and resolve it, mention, a time when you encountered that exact error yourself when you were first starting out, or, how you encounter similar errors on your own. And I think something that's really helpful with this is, not just helping the student who encounters the error, but actually going to the projector and working through your steps of solving it for the whole class. Often this would be something that would be pretty easy for me to solve, but sometimes I would be pulling up Google and going to Stack Overflow and figuring out what was going on with the student's code. And so really sort of modeling that process of, this is like a difficult learning process. And even when you've spent years and years doing it, you still encounter things that are difficult for you to do. So in conclusion, coding has a lot of sort of cultural baggage that statistics and math have to a lesser degree, and it's sort of a new type of baggage around it. But if we acknowledge that and then work with students who typically aren't served by the traditional computer science disciplines, they can get a lot of benefits and they see real results and reasons to learn programming in a social science quantitative methods course.
Thanks, Rob. All right, we are moving right along. We have two more presenters. And so next up is going to be Diogo Ferrari. He's going to be talking about teaching Bayesian statistics.
So let's first test the microphone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff and Justin, for organizing this. I think it's great to have a panel like this to organize, or the way we think about teaching methods in grad and undergrad courses. So it's great. So let me get started. The paper, or the topic that I decided to write about is Bayesian statistics, how to teach Bayesian statistics. So that is less about what people do or have done in courses for Bayesian statistics, but more about some ideas of how to teach Bayesian statistics for graduate students. Not all places that teach Bayesian statistics for graduate students. Maybe few of them. Few courses in political science has actually a Bayesian course, the course dedicated to Bayesian statistics for graduate students. So I kept asking myself how useful it is to have suggestions and tips to teaching Bayesian statistics. If, oh, nobody teaches it, or no, well, few departments actually have a dedicated course for Bayesian stats. In general, they cover statistics as a little part of other courses. So we talk about Bayesian statistics a little bit when you're teaching statistics in general or other methods. And I'm gonna go back to this point in just a second. There was a debate back in the 90s about teaching Bayesian statistics for undergrad and grad as well, as a way to teach statistics in general, right? So because the approach that you take, most of the colleges take nowadays, is to teach statistics for a non-Bayesian perspective. So whenever you're talking about teaching Bayesian statistics, you're talking about teaching frequentist approaches, non-Bayesian approaches, sampling procedures, p-values, confidence intervals, non-Bayesian statistics. So that debate in statistics, in the field of statistics about teaching Bayesian statistics, was about the value of teaching Bayesian statistics as an entrance for understanding statistical reasoning. Beyond that point, and I do not advocate to teach Bayesian statistics as a main course of statistical education, but there is a cost of not doing that when you are teaching Bayesian statistics. Because in general, we have that mindset that's not Bayesian statistics in general. We have a specific parameter that's fixed out there, and you're trying to learn the value of that parameter. When you're teaching Bayesian statistics for graduate students that have some background in statistics, that background usually means non-Bayesian statistics, or that mindset of learning about parameter, hypothesis test, and that kind of mindset. So when you're teaching Bayesian statistics for that type of students, graduate students with some background in statistics, they also have that kind of mindset of non-Bayesians, and then you have to help them, at least at the beginning, to start think Bayesian. Right? Start thinking about parameters that have a distribution before you collect the data, and that distribution is going to be updated by the data. And that's a little barrier at the beginning, because you see very often students writing something like, well, we have to learn about the true value of the parameter, or have to evaluate if the data, the value of the parameter can be rejected. So that's sort of non-Bayesian way to think. And you also see that in practice, that kind of half Bayesian approach, where people have a specific value of the parameter, but use the Bayesian approach because they don't have statistical methods, non-Bayesian good ways to do it. So there's a little cost of entrance at the beginning that I think could be mitigated with some little practice when you're teaching the course, and then that can generalize and can be beneficial for teaching the whole course more generally. So one thing that I think is useful is to teach Bayesian statistics using a procedure that builds up. I call that constructive procedure for teaching Bayesian statistics. Just sort of came up. It's not exactly any pedagogical term, but some people teach Bayesian statistics as a bag of tricks, right? So have many methods, many modules, and then you present many modules to implement in Jag or any specific software that the teacher is using, but the idea is the bag of tricks. So the approach is to use a very different approach in this case, the thing that I'm recommending, to avoid that kind of cost of learning statistics from a non-Bayesian perspective. The approach is to construct examples in each method or model that we're investigating from the very scratch. So we start by building up in a sort of 4 steps procedure, when we start by first devising the data method, the data model, and then you go to the selection of the prior, and then you derive the posterior, and then you compute the posterior quantities. So step by step in every single example, starting from the data model. The data model in general is not different from the non-Bayesian procedures, right? When you're selecting data for a model for the data, but then you go Bayesian when you start selecting priors, right? And that's an opportunity, that construction of the modeling, the model that they're going to use to investigate the data, is step by step, those 4 steps. That is an opportunity to help with that mindset shift from a non-statistic background to a non-Bayesian background to a Bayesian understanding of the problem. The pure Bayesian, actually. So you select the prior model, and then you derive the posterior and compute the quantities. And each one of those steps gives a setup, an opportunity to develop all the topics that you need to develop understanding of the Bayesian procedures, which is the selection of priors, how the prior is going to affect the estimation of the posterior, how that posterior can be evaluated using high posterior density intervals, and then, of course, evaluation of the way to compute the posterior density, which is analytical, and then you can go to MCMC. So using that this basic constructive four steps procedure to teach Bayesian statistics helps to give a sort of map for the steps that the students can do. And then one thing that I noticed is that you can sort of get some ownership of the modeling process. So instead of getting a shelf that you can pick methods there, you have actually a procedure that you can follow and then go from the data to the model that you are using to investigate the data. So I think that's is something that I find useful. And another thing that we can do together with teaching Bayesian statistics with those 4 steps procedure is also to have a side-by-side examples with Bayesian derivation, Bayesian analysis on one side, and then at the same time, we do a non-Bayesian statistics investigation of problems. So we have a parameter estimation using frequencies approach, and then you see a full example. Let's say a MLE estimation or construction of confidence intervals. And at the same time, we construct a Bayesian approach for the same problem. That's very helpful to help students to see the difference between the approaches and to do this mindset shift between the non-Bayesian to Bayesian procedures. The last thing that I'm going to mention is the bag of priors. It's very hard to teach Bayesian statistics even for graduate students with some background statistics because they're usually not familiar with the lack of distributions that we use as a prior, the Bayesian, the beta distribution, and many others. So those 4-step procedures can help in that sense as well, because in the second step is the prior selection. So we can discuss about priors, present different, I call it bag of priors, then you can present the student and they can select from that bag, and then to evaluate how that selection can affect the estimation of the parameters. So the basic idea, just to sum up, the basic idea of this 4 steps procedure to teaching Bayesian statistics is to follow that constructive approach where the students can actually design from the scratch the Bayesian procedure to evaluate the data. I'll be happy to answer some questions about this. And thank you very much again, Jeff and Justin, for organizing this.
All right, thank you, Diogo. So yeah, just for those of you who have some questions, we will be doing a Q&A in just a little while after our last presentation. So getting to that presentation, I was very happy to have a contribution to our symposium on qualitative and mixed methods. And this comes to us from Alan Jacobs, Diana Kapaszewski, and Sebastian Karcher. And they're going to present about using annotation for transparent inquiry. Take it away.
Okay, can everybody see the slides? Whoops, the bolding of my name is completely accidental. This is a joint project that is actually inspired by ideas that Diana and Sebastian had, who have been really the forces behind developing the technology that that the paper is based on. And essentially what we're presenting here is kind of a speculative proposal, pedagogical proposal based on a small handful of examples of instructors using the approach I'm going to talk about, but also grounded on this new technology for annotating research and making research more transparent. Here's the problem that motivates our thinking about this. The good news is that there have been really substantial advances in qualitative methodology over the last, say, 20 or so years. The articulation of a really quite crisp and distinctive logic of causal inference that operates within the case level, that's usually goes by the name process tracing. There's also been tremendous development in a range of interpretive methodologies, including ethnography, hermeneutics, and so on, as well as wide-ranging debate, discussion, development around understandings and practices of transparency and research openness and qualitative methods. But at the same time, there is at least one, and probably other, serious limitations in how we teach qualitative methods. And the limitation that we want to focus on is the really strong passivity of the learning. So what do students tend to do in our qualitative methods courses? Well, they learn the logic of, say, a method like process tracing from reading methodological texts about how the logic works. They read examples of process tracing in action, as, sort of qualitative research end products. But what they rarely do is to actually carry out their own qualitative analyses, say using process tracing with real data. And we know this in part via a survey that Emmons and Moravchik conducted of methods instructors. This is very uncommon. And if we compare this to, just the conversation we've been having, today, to common practice in quantitative methods teaching, where working with data is absolutely central. There's a really striking difference there. And of course, there are good reasons why quantitative methods courses have students get their hands dirty with data. And so we see it as a problem that's so rare in qualitative methods courses. And we see annotation for transparent inquiry, which I'm going to show you in a moment, as a tool that could be used to generate much more active learning in the qualitative methods classroom. So what is ATI? It is a technology developed, a tool developed by the qualitative data repository. As I've said, Diana and Sebastian have been really central to its development and actually get its increasing adoption by qualitative scholars. And it was developed to facilitate transparency in qualitative publications. And there are a number of pieces of published work out there that use it right now. It builds on sort of an older technology Andy Moravchik developed, known as active citation, for some of you who may have heard about that. The general idea is that ATI allows authors to annotate specific claims in their text with notes, excerpts from data, or links to primary to sources or data that readers can then go to. And these annotations are a digital overlay over the published work. On the back end, the data and documentation are stored in a data repository. So, the article becomes kind of a gateway. The annotation becomes kind of a gateway to this larger data repository. And it might look something like this. This is from an article that was published in the journal International Organization, where you've got the main text here, yellow highlighting, indicating there's going to be an annotation there. You click on it, and then this annotation pops up next to it, which could include, as you see here, an analytic note about how the data were being interpreted, as well as an excerpt from the actual piece of evidence, from the actual source being analyzed, and then a link to sort of a larger, to the source itself. So there are a number of things that we think instructors could use ATI to do, and we're sort of thinking about this in three broad buckets in the paper. One is still fairly passive, but perhaps passive in a deeper sense than what we can do currently with just having students read ordinary journal articles or books. And that is, it makes it much easier for students to retrace the analytic steps that an author undertook to arrive at their inferences, right? They can follow the inferential reasoning from the sort of raw evidence through to conclusions, right? Features of ATI, like those analytic notes, can bring coding decisions or analytic interpretive steps to the surface that would otherwise be, hidden from students. And so we can aid learning by sort of showing the process in greater detail. But there are also all kinds of opportunities then, once the raw data have been made available, for students to engage in more active use of qualitative methods. And I'll just run through a few quick ideas, and we give examples of exercises that a few instructors have using ATI in the qualitative methods classroom. So Juan Masulo, Robert Adcock, myself, they're examples from our teaching. So we can have students use use the raw data that are made available and the same analytic method and see if they come to the same conclusion. And if not, why not? This could make clear how different assumptions that researchers might make can affect the inference you get from the same data using the same method. We can have students use the same data but apply a different analytic method. We can have students bring additional data, right? And see how that changes the picture. We can also have students try to answer a different research question using perhaps the same method and the same data, right? And of course the permutations go on. But the examples we give show some of the examples we give in the text show some of these combinations in action. And then finally, we can use ATI to teach students to use ATI. That is, we can have students actually, as Juan Masulo does in his exercise, actually create their own annotations and teach them how to make their own qualitative research more analytically explicit, while, and this is a key sort of benefit of ATI, while retaining readability, right? You're not cluttering the main text with all of these analytic notes and excerpts and so on. It's sort of, one layer down, and you can go deeper when you want to. I'll just mention a couple of quick limits of sort of our claims and potentially of the approach. I mean, one thing that I would say actually sort of is not a limit. It might seem to be one at first glance is some of what we're talking about kind of sounds like replication exercise, but we would emphasize that there's nothing sort of intrinsic to, you don't have to be signed on to like a replicationist, epistemology or paradigm for it to have pedagogical value for students to be able to engage in this sort of direct active engagement with the evidence. And then finally, there are things that ATI doesn't reveal, like you can see excerpts of evidence, but you don't get to see how the original author selected that evidence from perhaps a larger universe of observations. It really does require that the annotations do link to primary evidence for our proposal to operate. Not all annotations do. And finally, as I mentioned, we only have a handful of test cases so far, but we'd be interested in seeing other instructors try this out and see if it can actually generate more active learning and sort of better pedagogy around qualitative methods. So, thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Alan. And thanks again to all of our presenters. We are now gonna turn it over to question and answer. I see that we've already gotten one question that was answered in the chat, but if there are others, we can take those as well. I believe, Justin, should participants just click raise hand, is that correct?
Well, there's a couple of different possibilities. You can just type your question into the Q&A text box if you want, and we will read your question aloud and allow people to respond to it. You can indicate in the Q&A text box that you want to be recognized to ask your question verbally, and we will unmute you and do that. And yes, there is a raise hand feature, and if you raise your hand, Jeff will presumably notice that and unmute you to ask your question. And I have a question too, so I'm going to put myself in the queue right now.
Justin, why don't you just go ahead? You can be first one up.
Yes, I'm going to abuse my moderator power once more. I don't know if my syllabus was in Clay's study or any of these other studies, but a perennial problem, let me put it like this. I definitely understand what it means to say that we're trying to put too much into the course, and yet I don't feel I'm spending too much time on any one thing. Our undergraduate program here at Wake requires only one quantitative and qualitative research methods course that's combined. And so a vast array of things that have to go in that we have to teach in that course is huge, right? We're doing interviews, and in some cases, and we're doing process tracing, and we're doing experiments, and we're doing panel and cross-sectional analysis, and we're doing RStudio, and we're doing philosophy of science. I mean, there's just so much to go into that. So my question is, I mean, of course, if you want to tell me what to do, that's great. But the real question, I think, is, what are we doing here, right? How many what level of competency or understanding are we expecting our undergraduate, especially, to attain, and how many courses does that really take, right? I am skeptical that you're going to get to any level of real proficiency in any of these topics in one course, and I have data to back that up. They do learn things, but the students learn things, but I don't think they truly become comfortable. And I think 2 or 3 courses is probably the minimum necessary. But on the flip side, trying to staff those 2 to 3 courses would create untold headaches and administrative problems and staffing problems and all kinds of things. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what are we trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to basically just pull a few students in to deeper understanding, and then the rest of them just sort of get the highlights, or what? What are we trying to do there with our undergraduates? Graduate students, it's a totally different matter.
Is this a question for me in particular or for the panel as a whole?
I think we can start with Clay, but anyone who wants to jump in, I think, would be welcome.
So we have the same problem, which is that we have a single undergraduate course, and depending on who you ask, like what's in the syllabus of people who taught at KU, it's a stats class, a programming class, a writing class, a research design class, a measurement class, and so that's too much. And having vacillated back and forth and done a little bit of it when I was in graduate school, it feels like the most important thing for the undergraduates is, can you consume political science work? And so can you, if you see the table in a piece of published work, are you still so uncomfortable with the material in it that you're skipping over it? And as long as the answer to that is no by the end of the course, then you've achieved something. And then hopefully you can imbue them with some skills that are useful in other classes, the way Rob was talking about, I think. So and I don't know if this is the right answer per se, but they're writing papers in every other course. So I feel like I can safely hack that part out of it and try and touch on the other topics and spend more time doing that than focusing on having them all write a research paper, which is going to be a lot of reading at the end of the semester anyway, and achieve sort of more of what we're trying to do. I don't know what the rest of you think.
I'll throw one quick thing out there. Our undergraduate methods class only basically does data analysis and not a lot of those other things. We recently created, and it's not even required for our political science majors, we recently created a qualitative methods course, or more of an introduction to methods without the stats, for some of our international studies major. So we've broken that out a little bit. I may post this in the chat if that's allowed, but I helped put together a certificate that students can take, and to address Justin's questions or concerns, it draws from courses in computer science, statistics, engineering, sociology, public health, all across the university, so that students in political science or other disciplines who want to establish themselves as having some credibility in this area can pull together all of those different courses from a variety of areas that might fit their. Most of them are not political science majors. I have students do health and human physiology and engineering and all sorts of different areas. So that's a way to kind of put something together that will benefit lots of students, but doesn't require 6 political scientists to teach the courses.
We've got, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say that we're lucky to have, we have a year-long sequence. And so therefore, I think Justin's exactly right. To fit all of those things in one semester it's hard to get any of them down correctly. And yes, there are staffing problems, but to the degree that you can advocate for having more classes, because I think everything that people touched on in this panel it's important stuff that students need to get to know. And in fact, if they have those skills to the degree that a year, let's say, offers, then they really are loaded for bear when they go out on the workforce. They can credibly claim that I have these qualitative skills, that I can go out and do these things. And it puts them head and shoulders above others in terms of their resumes when they go out into the world.
I mean, I can tell you just as a practical matter that what I've arrived upon is similar to what Clay did, which is the students coming out should be able to read political science research without being confused or freaking out, which leads to some interesting trade-offs, right? So do you really need to know what an R-squared is in order to do that? Not really, although it makes me very uncomfortable to teach regression without teaching R-squared. I do it because you don't really need to know that in order to understand an APSR article for the most part. On the other hand, it also has to prepare them for their senior seminar where they write a research paper. And so in that sense, they need to have enough RStudio skills and enough of a basic understanding of things so that they can go deeper in that class and get to where they can actually execute it, right? So they're not going to learn to become experts in process tracing, but they'll know what it is, and they'll know, okay, here's where I can go to get more information. Here's how I can get better at that. But it's, I would kill for a year-long sequence or a certificate and we might have one. I'm working on it, but we'll see. We should probably move on to other questions though, Jeff.
All right, we've had some questions in the Q&A that are about the students that come to us in our classes. Some of them are anxious about anything related to math, as one person notes, and then they learn at different speeds throughout the course. And so I'll just pose this to any of our panelists who would like to talk about that from the perspective of undergrads or graduate students. How do we deal with this heterogeneity in our student population in our courses?
I can say a little bit about that, if that's all right. So I think dealing with sort of different speeds at which students are able to grasp the material really helps when you sort of have everything be a group project. And so the students who pick it up a bit faster can help the students who don't. And I said this in the text Q&A earlier, but I think it's also really important when you have a group. So I use semester-long projects where one student is clearly picking up the material much faster than the others. So sort of work with the group and structure roles that the students are going to have, so that even if a student isn't going to be comfortably running regressions by themselves at the end of the course, they can still handle maybe some of the data cleaning or the visualizations that go with the work. So splitting things up like that. And then the other question about dealing with math anxiety. So one of the things I do teaching undergraduates is I have a pre-course survey, non-anonymous, but basically to ask students if they're feeling some sort of math or coding anxiety before the course begins. So I can be sure to check in with those students specifically throughout the semester. And then I find something that also helps a lot is to just really use concrete examples. And in that sense, also step outside of political science. As we all find political science interesting, but not everyone in these classes is a political scientist. Sometimes they're doing it to fulfill distribution requirements. So, using things like sports statistics, things like that to teach concepts like visualization, where you can use statistics from a season to teach bar plots and things like that, I think can be really helpful as well.
I can jump in.
Go ahead.
So I think a great deal of it depends too on your student body, which is a theme that's come up for a lot of our presentations, right? The general culture that exists within a program. So I know when I taught undergraduate methods, it was in a multidisciplinary honors college, and I didn't have any prerequisites. So part of how, for instance, I dealt with the heterogeneity among students as far as how fast they learn was that I at least mentioned extra things for the students that have learned faster that would be like up on our course management software. And I would make clear that they were optional, right? It wasn't like extra work. But for instance, like my engineering majors, when I'd mention, oh, this is actually just like partial derivatives and chain rule, I would have a couple of them stop by and be like, what do you mean partial derivatives and chain rule, right? So the point is trying to like channel it into other areas as well that would then get them connecting with the knowledge that they knew from their home disciplines coursework. And then for math anxiety, I wish any of us had the magic bullet for this one. But I know, again, so I can talk about what I've done. Like when I've taught the methods courses, I've actually started with not math. And I've actually just talked about the logic of research kind of intuitively, like what does it mean to reason about something? And then thinking about, well, you're making a claim about two things. How exactly might we find evidence of that claim, right? And then like slowly working up to it. So that worked when I did it at the Honors College because a lot of the students I had could at least think through, right? Like the logical ramifications of an argument, right? Like what would follow from what. And then they would have enough buy-in by that point to be like, oh yeah, like I do kind of have an idea of how exactly I should gather evidence for this particular claim, kind of sort of an idea. By the time we got to the math, it became more of a natural extension of trying to find a way to express the evidentiary information. It didn't always work, but I at least didn't have any rebellions, and I had a great deal more humanities majors say that they enjoyed the course far more than they thought, right? Because they were able to see the connections just with basic argumentation a lot more clearly. But again, the theme is it's so contextual. So I guess know your students is like the worst, most trite thing I could potentially say. But I'd be curious to hear what others' experiences there have been as well.
Thanks, Shauna. In the interest of time, I want to keep us moving a little bit. There's a question that came into the chat that I think is important for us to address live if we can. And so I'm going to go ahead and just paraphrase that. So that the question is from someone who said they just started teaching grad methods recently, and struggled in the sense that a lot of the things that Clay mentioned in his presentation kind of went wrong, and so course evaluations were not as good as this person would like, and so this presents a tension between trying to teach what we think is the very best material and sort of the best way to improve learning outcomes versus what's going to get good evaluations. And I think this tension is present in many courses, but it's particularly salient in methods courses and especially in graduate methods courses. So the first thing I'll say is to this person, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to talk with you about this question and your specific situation after today if you would like. But I would like to pose this question maybe to some of our tenured panelists who have some thoughts on this. So I'm thinking David or Fred or Justin in particular. I know you've taught these courses. Do you have any thoughts to add here?
I haven't seen, well, I haven't taught the courses myself, but as a divisional dean, I see a lot of promotion and tenure cases that struggle with this sort of thing. And one thing that you can, that's really helpful is that the chair and the department understands the sort of the challenge that you have teaching that particular course. And then it's what I'm seeing in terms of files that dossiers, that sort of thing that come my way is that if there's the genuine attempt by the professor to improve what's going on in the classroom, people understand that and actually applaud it. And so if that's the kind of conversation that's happening at your institution, you should feel free to do what's necessary for those learning outcomes, and they'll be respected.
I have a few suggestions because it's very common for methodologists to be tasked with nothing but methods courses. And well, a couple of things. First, you may be teaching graduate and undergraduate methods courses and you get great evaluations in the graduate courses, but that gets dismissed. You just say, oh, well, they're graduate students. Of course they love it. Well, no, like that's not true. There are such things as bad graduate courses. Believe me, I took a few of them. The second thing is I think that there's a very well documented and studied effect here. There are even publications that show that, you know, on a 5-point evaluation scale, if you're teaching this kind of course, you're going to take a point off no matter what you do, right? So if you're normally scoring in the, you know, in the 4s or 4.5s, you know, 3.5 is probably what you're going to be able to achieve, even if you're really knocking it out. And I'm always adapting my methods courses and always trying to make things better. And it pretty much always, you know, there's a ceiling that I just can't get above. So one thing you can do is actually do pre-test, post-test to prove that the students are really learning, and include that as part of your file. And the last thing I would recommend is insist on teaching at least one course a year that is not a methods course, because that, and is also not a graduate course, because that will help you demonstrate to your colleagues that you actually are a good teacher. And frankly, I think most of them already know this happening, and most are sympathetic. But it helps if you can say, you know, for example, I teach a corruption course usually once a year, and my evaluations of my corruption course are great. And my evaluations in my undergraduate methods courses are aggressively mediocre. And so it's like, well, you know, it's weird because I'm a methodologist, right? So I should be better at that. Probably I am better at that. But it, you know, assuming your colleagues want to support you, you know, giving all those ways for them to justify that, I think will help you get through the tenure process.
I don't see any other questions, so I'll weigh on this too, since we have a few minutes left. Also said in the chat, happy to talk more. Echo everything that Justin said about the hit on teaching any sort of mathematical political science course. I taught game theory in my first couple of years, and that didn't help my evaluations either. But you know, you get better and it improves over time. I would also say, on top of what Justin said, there are other biases that creep into these evaluations that are not just related to methods, but perhaps related to characteristics in the instructor, which we don't know in this case. And those are something else that you'd want to account for, your department should be accounting for. I guess the other thing I would say is that I have taught and know of methods classes that have been taught that perhaps didn't go as well as the instructor would like. And I would say that there are, you know, a variety of reasons why that can happen. And so, you know, again, happy to share some thoughts on ways that you can sort of target the class correctly, interact with the students correctly. You know, we occasionally have visitors who will teach a methods class and they just pitch it at completely the wrong level and lose the students, and then it's hard to recover. And those are the kind of things that oftentimes students might not want to share, but maybe talking with your colleagues or someone else outside your department might be able to offer, you know, some suggestions or advice in that way. And as I said, I'm happy to do my best.
Right. Diogo, I think you had your hand up at one point. Did you have a question or a comment before we end?
I think we have only 2 minutes, but I was going to ask about experiences for undergrad courses in methods to separate what's programming or teaching programming and teaching methods, because it's very hard to combine them in one course sometimes, especially with large classes. So if you teach include programming, you have to, students get confused, they cannot connect the two things sometimes. It's too short time. So I just want to know the experience that you have. So you have different courses, you have one course for methods, another for programming, you combine them somehow for the TA to teach programming. So I just want to hear a little bit of the experience, the actual experience with the course, because I have to waive that. I have not to teach programming last year because it was causing too much trouble for the TA and for everybody. So, and some colleagues recommended the same thing for me. So, so I just want to hear your experience on that. I think that goes first for Clay, Frederick, and Katherine that was talking about this at the beginning, but everybody else first.
I'll just briefly say that I taught it throughout, and we used Kosuke Amai's book, which follows the same material. But since I've left UNC, they've now split undergrad quant methods into a 2-course sequence. And so it still teaches programming throughout, but they only get through like regression with no measures of uncertainty in the first course. So there's just much more time on programming and the math.
Something that I'm seeing in that my colleague Simon Beschler is doing here at SU is just teaching a separate course that's billed as data science, that's essentially just programming with very little methods, but data science, these applications. I know a couple of other places are doing that. And that seems to be very attractive also to students, obvious labor market applications, those sorts of things.
All right, well, I think we are just about out of time. So Justin, I'll turn it back to you. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, I will jump in here. And actually, I think I have to make myself the host again. Anyway, I actually want to add one more thing to that, the programming thing. I helped solve a lot of my problems by running an RStudio server, which takes a lot of the configuration out of the student's hands and puts it in your hands. That made things immensely easier and smoother. But it does transfer the work to your end, and setting up the RStudio server is kind of annoying. But once it's up, it's up. All right, so we are out of time. We are actually just slightly over time. I want to thank everyone in our panel for being here today. I want to remind everyone that the presentation will be posted to our website shortly after the broadcast if you'd like to share the presentation with a colleague or watch it again later. And I also want to announce that this is the last IMC presentation for academic year 2020-2021, and good riddance to this year because it has rightfully sucked. If you wish to rewatch any of the talks given this year, they're available for viewing on www.methods-colloquium.com. And if you're interested in giving a talk in the IMC series for 2021-2022, which I'm hopeful will be a better year for all of us related to the pandemic or lack thereof, please contact me at justin@justnessery.com or take a look at our website, www.methods-colloquium.com. Thanks to everyone for being here. Thanks for our audience for being here. And I will see everyone next year.